Welcome to our Better Buildings webinar featuring NYSERDA's Real-Time Energy Management Program. I'm going to allow for just a couple more minutes for people to join, so we'll start shortly. Okay, I think we'll get started. We have a lot to cover today. Welcome, I'm Hannah Kramer. I'm the technical lead for the Better Buildings Alliance EMIS tech team. And I'm so pleased that we have Alicia Noriega with us today to share about NYSERDA, New York's very large and successful incentive program for EMIS systems in commercial buildings. This is a pretty unique program across the country, and as utilities across the country consider opportunities to incent energy management and information system type systems, we're presenting this today, and NYSERDA is coming today to give us an excellent model to learn from. So we're excited to hear from Alicia on this. I'll mention the slides and recording will be posted on the Better Building Solutions Center as always, and all the registered attendees will receive an email with this information of the posting. Next slide. So many of you have been a part of the Smart Energy Analytics campaign. Most of you know that the campaign has ended now, but there's an opportunity to continue meeting and being a part of this network that we've built over the past 4 years of organizations interested in energy management information systems. So there's engagement and technical support opportunities if you join the Better Buildings Alliance EMIS tech team. So you're not automatically signed up for the Better Buildings Alliance if you're a participant in the campaign. So reach out to this email address to get information on how to become a formal participant there. You'll still receive some, webinar announcements, things like that, but there'll be additional collaboration opportunities beyond that if you're part of the tech team formally. And I'll also mention that at the end of this presentation, it's pretty exciting, we have the final webinar on the cost-benefit research results and the opportunity to register for that. So that webinar is coming up on October 28th, and we hope to see you there. This is the culmination of the research on cost savings and market trends in EMIS. We've packaged it all up in hopefully a real easy way to understand. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm just going to start out with an overview to set some of the terminology for energy management and information systems, EMIS. A lot of you have seen this before, although you'll see we have a new graphic that can help us understand just the pieces and parts of EMIS. So we'll start with data sources here. Some EMIS may only bring in utility bills and intermeter data at the whole building level or sub-meters, while other EMIS bring in as much data as available, including all the building automation system data, IoT devices, and even distributed energy resource data like PV and batteries. So data sources really are a growing area. All that data has to be managed and organized in a data warehouse. And then the EMIS capabilities sit on top of that. So there's different capabilities that are potentially a part of any EMIS. Monthly data analytics is kind of like the utility bill analysis bread and butter for some tools. Other tools really focus on interval meter data analytics and finding energy waste using that interval meter data, performing automated monitoring and verification. So those are in that energy information system category. Then we have fault detection and diagnostic tools, which detect and prioritize HVAC system faults, generally using the building automation system data and potentially other data streams. And then finally, the automated system optimization includes control, whereas these other avenues are visualization and diagnostics. ASO includes control to minimize energy use across systems and do some optimization functions as sort of a supervisory control to the building automation system. So any EMIS may have multiple of these capabilities. They may focus on one, and increasingly EMIS are kind of combining capabilities. So you may find EIS and FDD in a combined tool on the market, or all four. So it's something you can ask questions about to vendors, like which of these categories they fall into. Next slide, please. And then using EMIS is where you get the savings. EMIS are tools, they're not measures. So they're tools that help you find things in your data that generally are kind of impossible to find with the amount of data we have in buildings these days. So just very briefly here, this graphic shows kind of the general process of, you have your data warehouse, you have your analytics layer, we talked about just now, and then you have to do stuff with that. So you have an implementation phase where the building engineer sees the results of these analytics, makes repairs or improvements, and then things are monitored over time. So you're not just making repairs and then wondering if they stuck. You can track your improvements, you can measure your energy savings, and gather more data. So the cycle continues. Next slide, please. So the technical support that's available from Berkeley Labs is in two main areas through the Better Building Tech team. We have building owners, managers, and operators support. Like I said, please join the tech team for more information on what you can get out of that. For those that are very familiar with the Smart Energy Analytics campaign, you'll notice that that website is now transitioning over to the Better Building Solution Center. So we've taken all the things you know and love from that website and moved it into what's called the Smart Energy Analytics Campaign Toolkit. And we're also here to answer questions about those tools, about those resources, and help you get started on your path using EMIS. If there's utilities on the call here or owners that work with utilities, of course, we're here to present these cost-benefit findings. We want to broadcast what we found through the campaign, through the cost-benefit analysis we've done, to try to get more programs like NYSERDA's out there, and we're available to provide technical support to explain the cost-benefit findings, talk about EMIS and MBCX, and help on the sort of the pre-design phase. And we're also available to review draft program materials, things like that. So please contact us if you have questions about that. Next slide, please. All right, so our feature presentation, Alicia Noriega joined NYSERDA in 2018 to work on building decarbonization initiatives spanning technology deployment and business model innovation. Her primary focus is running this R10 program, stands for Real-Time Energy Management Program for NYSERDA, which is a $50 million initiative scaling investment in energy efficiency improvements through a combination of smart building technology, data analytics, and consulting services. She has a master's in urban planning from MIT and a bachelor's in international relations from William & Mary. So as Alicia presents, please get your questions into the question box on your screen. I'll be aggregating these and asking the questions at the end. So get your questions in early to make sure we have time to cover them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia.
Thanks, and big thank you to Hannah and Claire and the rest of the Berkeley Labs team for having us here to talk about the R10 program. So as has been announced, I'm going to talk about NYSERDA's Real-Time Energy Management, or R10 program. I'm going to go through a little bit about what R10 is, even though Hannah did a really nice job describing what EMIS systems encompass, why we designed the program the way we did, some impacts we've seen in the market and our program evaluation, a case study, and then where we might be going with this in the future. Next slide, please. So NYSERDA describes R10 systems as a family of hardware, software, and secure internet connectivity that continuously transmits a building's current and historical performance data to the cloud, and then provides automated fault detection and diagnostics and supports demand response. R10 does this based on data exposed from monitoring the live operation of energy-consuming equipment and plants installed within the building. Next slide, please. So in this set of capabilities, R10 can optimize HVAC set points. So that's where we see the ASO capabilities come into play, optimize scheduling, and often uses FDD software to prevent faults and performance degradation, which is a big selling point for a lot of our customers. Next slide, please. Most often, we see projects which take data from the BAS and recommend optimization of HVAC equipment. So it's primarily cooling and ventilation equipment in large commercial spaces. But the more data streams we introduce from secondary and ancillary systems, so lighting or elevator banks, access systems, the richer the analytics can become and the more accurate the recommendations, and so the deeper the energy savings. So through the course of this program, we have piloted versions of R10 that offer a richer cost share to bring in more previously siloed systems to the R10 platform. And we're looking to encourage projects that also pick up these data streams from energy consuming loads within tenant spaces in future iterations of the program, which I'll touch on a little bit later. Next slide, please. So overall, R10 funds the hardware and software to aggregate data across disparate sources and provide analytics to drive improvements. Solutions funded can encompass a range of capabilities typical of EMIS systems, as Hannah mentioned, and because of that, there's a lot of buzzwords in this space that fit under this R10 umbrella and made it a little difficult for us at first to describe what R10 is. But most often, R10 systems do include the analytic and automation aspects that Hannah highlighted at the beginning. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we designed this program and 3 components that I think provided the backbone of a lot of its success that we've seen. So at the beginning, we had learned from other programs and early market stakeholder engagement that something like R10 or a data analytics layer is often value engineered out of projects. And certainly at the beginning, applying analytics or data analysis in real time to building systems was a fairly new concept. It was tied to big data, IoT, not super well tested in the energy management market. And there was a need for risk sharing with the building owners that were going to undertake these projects. So we offered a 30% upfront cost share incentive on installation of these R10 systems. And that incentive often made the simple payback period much more palatable for building owners. And when we were in the door, so to speak, the value of the benefits of R10 could really be demonstrated. So we have seen building owners that were hesitant, maybe at the beginning of the program, start with one building and slowly bring the others along and roll out R10 systems to those buildings as further value has been demonstrated. The second component here is, as with all enabling tools, R10 doesn't directly produce savings, but requires action and prioritization of the analytic results. So a BAS is already often exposing hundreds, if not thousands of data points to a facility engineer or building operator at any given time. So to make sure R10 is additive and not a further tax on their time and attention, we incentivize an R10 service component, which essentially provides an energy consultant team to the building operators to offer database but distilled key insights about the monitored systems. And these are also experts who are verifying the automated alerts that R10 is providing and validating any upgrade recommendations that the system is making. We also see this continuous availability of the service component as a way to protect the R10 technology from becoming orphan technology in a sense, because it really helps and ensures R10 is integrated into the ongoing operations of the building. And then as a final check on the quality of what the service vendors are providing their customer, we are also providing an objective review of vendor deliverables by having them submit their service reports to us biannually as project deliverables on which our ongoing service payment is based. So why we did this component is, in the past, and this came out in stakeholder engagement, there had been some circumstances where vendors displayed enthusiasm in the beginning and set up their systems, and then kind of are never to be heard from again unless there's a major issue. So we are really committed to making sure our end use customers are receiving value from these investments. And the final component here is solving for market confusion. So when looking at solution providers in the IoT or big data space, there are a lot of claims that tend to be overblown or marketing fluff, and the building space is no exception. I think we've heard a lot of claims around AI and ML and digital twins that kind of don't bring to bear what they claim. So the end use customer potentially getting burned by vendors was something we took really seriously and wanted to design around as best we could. So we have a fairly rigorous vendor qualification process, which every vendor who is bringing a project in for cost share needs to go through. And our list of qualified vendors are actually quite respected by other organizations and building owners. I've heard anecdotally this list is consulted for finding qualified vendors for their own needs and programs. And then vendors must demonstrate that they can successfully provide customers with ways to monitor energy use, provide optimization, and deliver energy efficiency services through our interview process, our requirement of an in-person product demonstration, and reference and case study requirement. Next slide, please. So just to quickly say, R10 as a combination of these three things emerged from this iterative design process. And we have had the most success focusing on people, process, and technology versus just one of those things. Next slide, please. R10 is a vendor-based program, and this speaks to our theory of change that vendors need to be self-sustaining, with or without the R10 incentive, and be able to successfully pitch and sell the value of these solutions. So as I mentioned, we do qualify our vendors. They bring in the projects for cost share. We have 53 that are qualified and active, so have had a project in the last year. Most of the vendors we see want to be qualified on their system and service offering, although we do see a select few that offer service only and pair with a system only vendor. Next slide, please. So I wanted to offer a snapshot of what we see in R10 projects when I say service report. Again, this is a biannual program deliverable for each year of service that we have cost shared on. And just for further information, we cost share on up to 5 years of service. So this isn't the real-time dashboard that the end users are seeing, but it is a static snapshot of recommended ECMs the service provider has made based on the monitored mechanical systems. And we try not to ask for anything above and beyond what they're already preparing for their customer. So this is something that their customer, whether that be the building operator or the facility engineer, is seeing. But we do ask as a minimum requirement to highlight in some format the prioritized list of energy conservation measure recommendations, along with the associated calculated potential savings from those ECM adoption in both energy and cost, and whether the customer has chosen to accept or implement those measures. Many vendors go above and beyond those base requirements depending on what their customer wants to see, and we see some variation in how these are presented, but we do ask for these columns as a minimum. We also ask for the time series data of the monitored points that inform this list. Next slide, please. Provided just a quick snapshot, although we all know basically what I'm talking about. One thing to point out here is we have started asking for this data in Project Haystack naming convention so that we're able to better compare these points across projects. And this can also provide another M&V tool for both us and the customer when kind of looking back to see what was implemented and when and how it adjusted those end use loads. Next slide, please. Oh, you can also next slide, please. Thanks. So I wanted to zoom out and talk a little bit about our overall program impact. This is a snapshot of our R10 dashboard, which you can actually go see on the NYSERDA R10 site. It's updated weekly, and you can toggle on the site between commercial, multifamily, and industrial sectors, which are the three sectors R10 is offered to right now, and kind of zoom in and out on the map to see locationally where projects are concentrated. I'll say overall, the majority of our projects to date have been in the commercial space in New York City. Obviously, our reach is all over the state, but there's just a greater density of large commercial buildings that really see the value of EMIS in New York City. Multifamily is a sector that's kind of close behind and continuing to grow rapidly. And then industrial is the newest sector we're offering R10 to. Really, its release was late 2019, so the ramp up kind of coincided with COVID budget shortfalls. So industrial is lagging behind right now, but it's certainly a sector that could benefit from these systems. Next slide, please. So in our M&V process, which I'll talk about more in a minute, we categorize energy conservation measures based on the mechanical system impacted by the project. So it's kind of interesting to look at where these are coming from. R10 projects have primarily focused on base building cooling system in the commercial space. You can see cooling and ventilation accounts for a lot of those. In multifamily, where R10 is typically applied to the boiler room, those make up a lot of the heating related ECMs. And then we have a mix of smaller commercial and other sectors that make up the remainder. Next slide, please. We also categorize the energy conservation measures by type. So there are four main buckets into which all the ECMs fall into. The majority of the ECMs are set point control and sequencing and scheduling. And these are measures generally identified by vendors during the first year of service and are readily understood and implementable, and are also obviously medium to low or no cost. And this tracks with the fact that the majority of the projects in this sample set are year one with a couple of year two projects. Our working hypothesis here is that R10 should help identify and justify capital projects later on in its service years, so years kind of 3 to 5, which is one of the reasons we provide cost share on 5 years of service, and one of the reasons we do longitudinal M&V and continue to track projects that are in our sample pool throughout their lifetime. Next slide, please. So we're looking at here weather normalized kilowatt hour per square foot savings. I think it's worth briefly describing our measurement and verification process. We do an internal M&V process annually where we take a random sample from our project portfolio. So this phase of M&V had 40 projects in the sample, and it was completed in November 2019. So we're actually wrapping up another M&V process later this fall that has a slightly larger sample size, and I can easily share those results with anyone interested. We follow IPMVP option C, so that means we take 12 months of utility baseline data from 1 year prior to the installation of the R10 system and 1 year post the installation of the R10 system, and calculate the difference of the total energy consumption during the baseline period and performance period, and then we weather normalize those results using total degree days. We do an additional cross-check that there haven't been any other major changes in the building that would account for a substantial proportion of those savings, like major occupancy changes or retrofits that were not captured in the service reports. And to do this, we do qualitative interviews with the customers in our sample pool. So you can see, I think from this sample that of commercial office and healthcare, we're seeing a lot of large commercial office, and then healthcare obviously both have higher EUIs, really ripe for energy management related savings. Something interesting to note about the multifamily savings is a lot of our multifamily projects, as I mentioned, are concentrated in the boiler room. They're looking at heating systems. So these savings, as opposed to being year round, are from the heating season. Next slide, please. So we always get questions to R10 on cost. It's a bit challenging in our experience because a single dollar per square foot number or even a range has never fully made sense when trying to communicate the costs of R10 projects. And that's because the projects can vary pretty widely in their complexity and scope under the umbrella of R10. So it depends on how much hardware the project requires, how much integration is being done, how old the building is, how many upgrades to the BAS are needed so that it can talk to that R10 system. So we do see a pretty strong variation based on those factors. If the project does have a BAS and a data gateway ready to go, and we're looking at a software overlay, cost could still vary based on how many integrations the customer wants to do. So for example, we ran a pilot set of projects called R10 Premium, which you see represented in the commercial set here farther to the right on the higher cost end, because we required secondary and ancillary systems to be pulled in. So lighting, elevators, monitoring there, and then occupancy and weather information, and monitoring of all utilities in the building versus just electric. So those costs represent the cost of forcing these siloed systems to be integrated, and obviously they came in at a bit of a higher price point. Next slide, please. I did want to take us through an R10 project case study. Next slide, please. This is a case study that ESRT did with the Empire State Building. And they use the vendor Cortex, which is one of our software as a service, pure building analytics vendors. This was a pure software overlay onto the BAS. So these are the projects we see where the ROI is typically really compelling. The network infrastructure for data gateway exists, and it's just the software analytics and algorithms and service component that are driving the price. This Cortex project came in at $540,000. NYSERDA provided $140,000, and $400,000 of private investment was leveraged. Next slide, please. So the Empire State Building engineering team used this R10 system to drive a broad number of operational changes. And in this chart, you can see what a couple of those were and how it drove down the load curve to optimize for that specific building and those specific use cases. So they recommended pushing HVAC start time based on what's going on in the building on any given day, ensuring the building does not set a new monthly peak at any point, which if they do, those demand charges in New York City can be the majority of energy spend in large buildings like this. It corrected overcooling in certain areas, so tenants are happier, and they're turning off some overnight vampire loads that were identified based on this system. So they're really making recommendations on a dynamic, continuous basis and providing automation of the processes that will drive persistent savings. Next slide, please. And then just wanted to point out they're doing the same thing on the steam system in this project. Steam is really pervasive throughout New York City in large commercial, especially in Manhattan, and it's a pretty outdated and inefficient system. So achieving steam savings is a big win on several levels, especially if we're talking about emissions. And you can see here was another set of operational improvements where they're driving down the load curve, making sure not to set a new monthly peak, and really achieving savings while still providing the tenant completely adequate heating needs. Next slide, please. This was the first year of having this R10 project running. There was incredible ROI. The total savings here accounts for weather and occupancy. And actually, we did another calculation of savings with ESRT, taking out the portion attributable to AHU and lighting upgrades, and found there were still savings of over $1 million attributable to this R10 project from electricity and steam savings. Next slide, please. And I would encourage, if case studies are something that interest you, please check out our website. We've done a number of detailed case studies, a couple of deep dives, and there are technical resources there as well. If you're interested in kind of diving into the numbers and the anecdotal process. Next slide, please. So we're about 3.5 years into the R10 program. We have seen some pretty large successes, but we're always trying to iterate and evolve and see where we can drive further market transformation. So I did want to share a couple things about where we're going looking forward. Next slide, please. So this graph is taken from a report that came out of the Building Technical Working Group from the New York City Mayor's Office, and it's showing building greenhouse gas emissions by end use. This is a huge, building emissions are a huge focus for the city of New York right now, and obviously also the state of New York. So it's really important to understand what's driving them, and therefore how we can address them. Our R10 program so far has touched space cooling and ventilation, maybe some projects with lighting, but not really much else. So if we look at the commercial sector, the commercial building sector breakdown in the middle here, you can see we're touching about 24% of what's driving emissions by end use. So in thinking about the next iteration of R10 and how the program can continue to evolve, we are looking at pulling in more of these secondary and ancillary systems, including going into tenant spaces and looking more at tenant energy management, because a lot of these loads are primarily driven from what's going on in tenant spaces. Next slide, please. The focus on tenant energy management had an unfortunate but kind of timely intersection with what's going on with COVID and what tenants are now demanding from their landlords and building owners in terms of monitoring air quality and occupant density management. So we're seeing these same tenant energy wellness and comfort systems that verify where space is occupied, the temperature, the level of fresh air in a space, integrate really well with energy management systems overall. And one thing we're looking at is connecting this larger value stack as a motivation to go deeper with R10 systems. At the same time as bringing in these wellness features, we could bring in tenant space monitoring and energy management. And it's really important from a whole building energy and carbon reduction standpoint to get a better hold on phantom loads in tenant spaces. This was highlighted really well when occupancy levels in New York City buildings dropped down to 0 or 2%, but the energy consumption levels dropped down only about 15 to 20% on average. A lot of building operators did not know what was driving the loads in these unoccupied spaces because nothing in the leased spaces were visible to the building operator. So there's really a need for more remote monitoring and control of these spaces. So it kind of had highlighted a theory and really cemented this hypothesis about where we should go with R10 next. Next slide, please. I think this wraps it up for me, and I'm happy to transition into questions.
Thanks, Alicia. That last topic of COVID is obviously a hot topic, so I'm going to ask a couple questions around that. So with that statistic, you said that occupancy was very low, but energy consumption was only down 15 to 20%. How are the R10 systems of the participants in your program being used to manage these partially occupied buildings? Are you finding that the owners are happy to have the R10, they're using them in certain ways, or what are you hearing about that?
Yeah, so the R10 systems that are deployed for the most part now are offering remote monitoring and sometimes control in common spaces via base building systems. So a lot of the high and unexplained consumption during COVID vacancies were from tenant space loads. So most of our projects didn't touch those because we haven't really seen projects that push R10 systems into tenant spaces and offer energy management in those spaces. But it's certainly a compelling value proposition to do that more so in the future.
Okay, great. And then a question about M&V. So let's see, regarding the upcoming M&V of the program, would you anticipate changes in energy due to COVID? Probably the answer is yes. So if so, how will these factor into the savings analysis?
Yeah, I think that this is an issue that our whole industry is grappling with right now. And I'm actually going to buzz in my colleague who I haven't, he hasn't gotten to speak yet. Thomas, do you want to address this question?
Yes, this is Thomas here with NYSERDA. We are now contemplating how we will shift the baseline to represent post-COVID conditions. So that will actually be by itself a very interesting set of studies. And we do anticipate that R10 data will be very helpful in providing a pretty comprehensive view inside these buildings post-COVID, where we have already heard buildings that are increasing, certainly ventilation, that are now putting in MERV 13 or better filters, increasing humidification of the indoor air, installing germicidal lighting inside airstreams. So all of these measures is designed to try to make occupants more comfortable when they return to the buildings, but they all have impact to energy use in the buildings. So we're considering shifting the baseline period to post-COVID, and then look at the measures that the R10 system identify, all within the period of time that is that the building has adjusted to the post-COVID occupation.
Thanks, Thomas. That was very helpful. Okay, so now transitioning to a question about kind of the creation of the program. And I'll just also remind attendees that LBNL is available to consult with utilities. And in fact, we provided support to NYSERDA at the early stages of the R10 development as they were considering approaches. So the question here is, can you talk about how NYSERDA decided to create the R10 program, and how did you prove cost effectiveness?
Yeah, so I can take that one and invite Thomas to add anything I miss. So this kind of started as part of the REV process, Reforming Energy Vision in New York, which marked the shift from NYSERDA running traditional incentive programs to focusing more on market creation and market transformation. So NYSERDA was looking for more novel ideas of market creation and landed on the focus of energy management and kind of how to really institutionalize energy management with a focus on continuous equipment upgrades and data. So the market buzz with vendors that were playing in this space at the time were not really on commissioning, retrofits, and ECMs, but on analytics and software and big data. So there were some kind of communication failures there in selling these systems to interested building owners. And so that's where we kind of decide to focus and grow R10 in helping that business case take off and really sell the value of EMIS systems in the New York State market. For cost effectiveness, you know, this is a NYSERDA metric. We were looking at coming in under $20 per ton of CO2e reduced. We've demonstrated that the program can easily hit this number and actually come in far below this number. But how we looked at it at first, we get carbon factors by fuel type set by DPS, and we looked at our market size for R10 and calculated how much savings we expected to come from R10 type systems. And then obviously over time, we're able to kind of ground truth those numbers with actual savings.
Great, thanks, Alicia. Next question. So you mentioned the R10 premium earlier about how you added additional layer of data and analytics. So the question is, did you find you achieved more savings per square foot with this additional layer, or is there not enough data yet to really know that?
Thomas, I'll throw another one to you. Do you want to talk about R10 premium savings?
Sure. The short answer is none of these projects have enough runtime yet for us to evaluate using our MMV methods. But one of the interesting aspects of the program was the fact that many of the commercial real estate owners was very interested in the integration aspect of R10. We didn't expect that. We will initially focus a lot on savings, but the customers were telling us that the integration part of the R10 Premium program, common terminology that they use is put a lot of different systems on a single pane glass. They found that it's very beneficial in terms of non-energy benefits of helping them operate their buildings more efficiently. So we don't have data to evaluate energy saving the way that we like to evaluate it using our MMV methodology. But so far, the take-up rate has been very, very positive. It was oversubscribed very quickly. And now this is part of the consideration of how do we reset the baseline for these projects post-COVID.
Great, thanks, Thomas. I'm glad you brought up the single pane of glass aspect in helping operators not have so many interfaces to navigate. Thanks. This is actually another question related to integration. What are some lessons learned within the R10 program, you know, from inception to today, more lessons about integration, lessons about monitoring or finding opportunities? Do you have some advice for others?
Thomas, go for it.
Okay. Well, we definitely learned a lot, and I think one of the it may be beneficial if anybody on the webinar is interested in kind of doing a more deeper dive on how this program may apply to their particular territory or customers. Just please go ahead and reach out to us. I think one of the contributors to the program's success is the fact that it is not a traditional custom incentive project type of approach. So the customers were able to essentially bank the incentives right at the upfront budget planning stage, and that turned out to have a fairly significant impact. We found that because of that, R10 were basically included in a lot of the upgrade that the building were considering doing, but they were going to essentially leave out the analytics because that part of it had a lot of uncertainty. Because of our incentive, analytics became part of the many capital projects, or whether they're upgrading the chiller plants or boiler plant inside these buildings, then they need to upgrade to control systems. And then that actually is an ideal time to include R10 or EMIS because you will have essentially the data gathering from very early on, and it really help the MMV part of the capital project. So I would say that one of the key learning was just how important that upfront, not performance-based incentive played in adoption. The other key lessons learned is how important our service vendors played in consuming the data on behalf of the customers. A typical building engineers, chief engineer, building operators, day-to-day job is very, very busy, as we all can imagine. And a lot of the times, they do not have the luxury of consuming the analytics that's developed by these programs, by these systems. So having a vendor that is trusted by the building owners and building operators, consuming the data, developing specific recommendations on a day-to-day basis, and then convert those into essentially actionable items. So the building operator could just go ahead and execute them, turn out to be another great deal of benefit to the building owner. And lastly, I would just say that one thing we really see a increasing growth in adoption is this idea of predictive analytics. When the program started, we see a lot of it were falling under the guidelines of reactive analytics. But now increasingly, we really see a trend toward the predictive analytics. And we see that as a trend that really bodes well for continue to drive down the carbon footprint of the buildings in New York.
Thanks, Thomas. I have a follow-on question to that with related to the service providers. Did you find a range of levels of service? Like, did anybody get a level of service that included more on-site hands-on support, or was it all more remote analysis and digging into some root cause analysis remotely?
All of the above. Because this program is statewide and it supports a wide variety of commercial properties, from relatively small properties to multi-million square foot skyscrapers in the middle of Manhattan. It's really very much dependent on the business process that the building owner operators were looking for. So it does range from having some more frequent visits of the vendors. It's a little bit like the commercial of your fridge calling in services, and the guy shows up before you know things were broken. There was a little bit of that happening, that the folks just coming to the site and proactively adjusting set points and troubleshooting potential failures. We also see vendors that are essentially doing everything automatically, all remote. In fact, there's quite a few large vendors that have centralized facilities around the country that consume these data, develop analytics and reporting, and then send the information back to their local folks to bring it into the building. The service aspect of it, we think, is really dynamic, because as the customers gain an experience with these systems, we see the service have to essentially grow and adjust their value proposition, their service model, to continue to be relevant.
Great, thanks. That's very helpful. Here's a question about kind of the relationship between FDD and ASO, so fault detection and automated system optimization. So for your projects in the R10 program, just approximately how many were more fault detection, where then you have to follow up on the issue, versus an automated correction through having a control layer within the EMIS? Did you see, in our programs, we tend to see mostly FDD and not so much ASO, but just curious about the R10.
Yeah, from an ASO perspective, we still see a lot of ASO that have a man-in-the-middle model. We think that's really an artifact of just the way that the buildings are operated in New York City and New York State. It's not necessarily representing the limitation of the technology, but certainly FDD is really becoming a basic table stake to participate in the marketplace, not just in our program in New York. We really started this largely in the remote monitoring-based commissioning type of use cases. But increasingly, we really see a lot of FDD just becoming standard table stake capabilities. And as I mentioned before, we see predictive analytics is beginning to kind of take hold. I would say, aside from typical marketing fluff, a fairly significant, a large percentage of our vendor base have reported to us that they have incorporated artificial intelligence and machine learning into their analytics algorithms. And we see that as a kind of a very good market infrastructure to set up well as increasing or more data is generated through these building systems, and less of the data becoming really even possible to be analyzed on a manual basis, and therefore you really do have to depend on more sophisticated analytics capabilities to consume all that data.
Mm-hmm. And thanks, Thomas, for bringing up machine learning and artificial intelligence as it relates to EMIS. I'll also mention that the previous presentation Jessica Granderson did for the EMIS tech team here was about just that and demystifying what that can do with relationship to building performance. So we'll also include that link when we send around these slides in case you missed that presentation. It was really helpful in understanding the landscape of what that's all about and how it might relate to EMIS. Here's another question. So the background of this one is kind of like the market sectors. You've talked about a lot of large buildings. You have Empire State Building. What's the most common building size? Is it mostly large buildings in your program, or you go down to smaller buildings as well?
I would say most of the most common property participating in the program is a commercial office building. The average square footage is probably between 300 and 350,000, although we have multi-million square foot buildings to relatively small commercial buildings. But the program supports all commercial properties as long as they meet a New York State criteria of paying into the system benefit charge. So we have everything from a few thousand square foot retail spaces, restaurants, and all the way up to several thousand unit multifamily buildings, and obviously tens of thousands to million square foot office buildings. So all of them we have represented in the program, but the most common is commercial office building.
And then kind of a follow-on question, for the smaller buildings, did you find they implemented a certain type of R10 system most often, or was there any trends in that area?
Certainly smaller buildings don't have BAS, so data acquisition really have to come from meterings and sensors. What we found is there's essentially a couple of very popular use cases. One is essentially R10 takes a position of a building automation functionality that they would essentially not only handle HVAC, but they will integrate lighting and other loads within the space. And the other thing we notice a lot is the integration point tends to be around smart thermostats. Several of our vendors offer meter-based and thermostat-based systems. So so we do see that in the program as well. Because of the nature of these data acquisition systems, IoT devices, metering, they can scale to a very small building, small space, all the way up to tens of thousands of square feet, heat and cool through a rooftop package unit. So it's a very scalable architecture. Obviously, as you get into million square foot commercial office towers, you start looking at central plants, where the system have to expand from central plants, whether that be a chiller plant or boiler plants. And so those those data acquisition systems tend to be a little more sophisticated.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point about the R10 or the EMIS taking on a BAS functionality when there was no BAS to begin with, so that there is maybe a connected thermostat function that small businesses can do on a portfolio basis as well. One last question before we have to wrap up here. When do you expect the BAS capabilities to include FDD capabilities? And we know that some of the BAS vendors do include FDD, or maybe it's an add-on module, but I guess this is a question of more of like, as a matter of course, when you buy a BAS, when do we expect that it will actually include the type of FDD that we're used to seeing in R10 systems?
As you said, this varies depending on vendors. All of the major BAS vendors participate in our program. Some of them were earlier than others, mostly because some of their the analytics weren't available as a cloud-hosted solution, which is required by our program. I would say the general answer to your question is today. The way that we talk to customers is you really shouldn't just update BAS today without adding the analytics. Almost all the vendors, BAS vendors today, offer some sort of analytics packages. They may price them differently. They may have different integration schemes, but they're all available. Additionally, when you do a BAS upgrade, that's an ideal time to incorporate analytics that is even from a third party, whether that's through a standard BAS backnet data gateway into the cloud-hosted analytics, or through a variety of different field devices integration, all possible today. And we really believe that you really shouldn't upgrade a BAS today. Think about the cost and the interruption and the scope of that kind of project. Adding analytics is a fairly small percentage of that overall project scope. So you really should do it just as a matter of protecting your investment into the BAS upgrade.
Thanks, Thomas. That's actually a great summary and a call to action for the folks on our call. Thank you very much to NYSERDA, to Alicia and Thomas for their great presentation and support of the Q&A. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, we have the final results on the Smart Energy Analytics campaign. When you get the slide deck, you'll have the link to register for that. So please take a look at that. So we have one more slide here. No. Okay. So feel free to contact me. I put my info in the chat, or contact Alicia and Thomas with questions. We're here to answer your questions and help. I think we did get just through all the questions today, but I really appreciate your interaction in the webinar. We always have a really good attendee list and a really good list of questions. So again, thanks Alicia and Thomas, and have a great day.